stuff that I've heard is that the Native Americans actually also gave Joseph Smith the temple ordinance. But tell us a little bit about the temple ordinance, and if you know anything about how Joseph Smith may or may not have gotten the temple ordinance himself.
Well, I've been out of unity with I've been out of connection with the LDS Church for over 20 years now, so I don't know what's going on up there in their temples. It's really none of my business. But there is a story in my family history on my mother's side, which is the bird family. Forgive my voice. We have some trees that are pollinating right now that don't like me. So you'll just have to struggle through with me. But on my mother's side, which was the Bird family, and Charles Bird and Benjamin Freeman Bird were both personal bodyguards and scribes to Joseph Smith. There is a story that was inserted in the back of one of the family Bibles that just kind of emerged from obscurity in the 90s that I read when I was a teenager or a young adult and had no idea what I was reading. But makes a whole lot more sense now to me, having been involved in the translation. But it was about a man named Louis Daines, or more familiarly, they called him Daney. And he was reportedly the first, if not the first, one of the first Native American men who were ordained to be elders. And he brought a book that that was first translated into French by his grandfather. The Catholic French up in Canada wanted no part of it, so he kept it. And then he retranslated it into a poor English and gave it to his son. Or he gave it to his son, and his son translated it from the French to kind of a rough English. And then he gave it to his son, who reportedly gave it to Joseph and Hiram Smith. Now, Hiram didn't like it because it was written in a Native American-y way. It was very, very Aboriginal, very indigenous, and he knew that his people, the Europeans, were not going to accept it. And so the story goes that they took and they rewrote it into a language or a parlance that all the men, at least in the church, would understand, and that was Masonry, Freemasonry, and it worked. The metaphors are almost exact. I mean, we have a Pele, or one of our high ministers, one of our elders here in Missouri was a bishop. He was just released, but he served as a bishop. And he said a bishop of the LDS Church, and he said that he began to understand the temple ordinances much better having read the book than, before. There's a lot more detail. The version that we have is not a Reader's Digest version. It's not an abridgment at all. It is, in fact, the ordinance takes 3 days to accomplish. Excuse me. But anyway, that's the story in my family, that it was delivered to Joseph and Hiram Smith. And then, it corresponds, I believe, I haven't checked the dates, but the family story is that it corresponds to right about the time when the endowment was introduced. The endowment ordinance was introduced. So between Kirtland and Nauvoo, right in that area. So that's our story. And it was so important to the Bird family that Charles Bird named his son Martin Louis Daney Bird. And there's no Louis. Our family runs their family names all the way through the genealogy, all the way back to Charlemagne. Never, ever did they break with the idea or with the custom of transmitting family names. Martin Louis Daney Bird was a complete breach of that family custom, because there was no Louis or Daney or Danes or anything like that through the whole family history. You simply won't find it. So Charles honored Louis Daines by naming his son Martin Louis Daney Bird, and that's my grandfather's father.
So you have kind of a convergence of Native American, but also sounds like some pioneer heritage, early members of the church that kind of converged into who you are now.
Yeah, both Benjamin Freeman Bird and Charles Bird were in that first group. They were in Zion's camp, the Covenanters of Zion's camp. So that put them kind of right smack in the middle of LDS church history. They did not go out to Utah with the handcart companies. Their job was to build handcarts and wagons. So they stayed in winter quarters. That's where my grandfather was born, was under a wagon in winter quarters. And they came out later when the train went through. So they came out in comfort. They didn't enjoy all of the hardship and privation of a handcart journey. But then once they had gotten out to Utah, they just melted right into the LDS church. And
Man, look at all they missed.
I don't know.
So
So
I got a
so-
question.
go ahead.
At what point, when you're looking at these plates and you're receiving the story, at what point did a light bulb go off based off of your LDS heritage? Like, whoa, could these be connected? And then at what point did you figure out that they were connected?
That happened before I ever got taken to where the records were. That happened when I was sitting in jail. I was convicted. I served 6 months in jail. My conviction was theft by false promise. It had to do with natural medicine. I'm a naturopathic doctor, and these things are pretty common. When I was in jail, I was also they sent me up to Cottonwood, which is North Idaho Correctional Institution, which is a boot camp. And because I was older and had a PhD and could be used as sort of a father figure, they stuck me in a barracks full of 18 and 19-year-old drug abusers, drug sellers, drug manufacturers. They were guys who were all charging with drugs, and it was absolutely bedlam. So I prayed fervently for some kind of relief because I was terrified to sleep. I was the only guy over 19 years of age, and there were 150 people in that room with me. And that's when it happened. I was taken aside by an ancestor, and he began to tell me the story of the first of the Nemenhan. That was Hakotl, who the Mormons call Hagoth. And I knew at that point, because I joined the LDS Church when I was 16 years old. I knew the story. So there was no mistaking the connection at that point. And it gave me some comfort. Later on, I recognized some of the children and, some of the sons and grandsons of some of the folks that I knew when I worked for the INS, recognized me, and they kind of converged around me, and I had this little bodyguard that followed me everywhere. It was pretty cool for about a month. But I got out, and right after I had served the months that I was to serve, they put me on 20 years of supervised probation. Right after that is when I was kidnapped and went up on the mountain. Now, not long, about 10 years after that, evidence was presented to the court, and there were 2 cases, and the judges in both cases expunged, withdrew, dismissed, expunged the whole thing, so that now that, the IRS can't even get information about that legal period that I went through. There's no record of it at all. But during the time, it was pretty hard. It was very, very difficult. I came out of jail, and I had been convicted, and I was still allowed to have a temple recommend, but my bishop had to hold it for me. I could not go to the temple. They called me to be high priest group leader in my ward so that I could teach people about the temple, but I wasn't allowed to go there myself. It was rough times for me and my family. I had little children at that time. So it was, and I went through a decade of trying to preserve the baby in the bathwater. And at a certain point, it just couldn't work anymore. And that was years ago.
So then, so
so
you get to the point to where you're in translation. Talk to us a little bit about, there's you and there was a group of translators. And so you're going through the translation process, and maybe just tell us a story of actually producing and getting the record done, and what that was like.
Well, that was rough. There was never any intention of anybody but our family reading the book. It was done as a family history only. It got out by accident. But how it happened was Cesar Padilla, Tui Padilla, who was Cesar's uncle, was the head of the council. His nephew, Cesar was also one of the translators. And then Porfirio Munoz de Tiu was an Ethiopian member of the family. He was over in Ethiopia when he began. He was a member of the council. And then Menemes Shen is a not exactly sure what you properly call them. It's just kind of like a nun in a Buddhist monastery in Taiwan. All of us are cousins. We're all descendants of Hagopal, and that's why we are able to do this type of translation. None of us speak the same language. I speak Spanish, so I can communicate with Cesar and Tui. I don't speak Arabic, so I can't really communicate much with Porfirio. But when we're upon the way together, we can understand each other. And that's because of the Holy Ghost. So what we endeavor to do is go upon the way and translate, and then come back into the waking state and write. Then when we got to, we would designate a certain amount, and then we're all going to get together and we're going to compare. And that's what we did. We got together and we compared and we debated and we tried to come up with the most accurate in our own languages translation of what we saw. This is a very dead language, and there isn't a lot of guidance except over there on how to do this. Even so, you know the story. We men outvoted the one woman on the council over and over, and we ended up using names that we were familiar with out of the Bible and the Book of Mormon. She's Buddhist, so she had no background in those names, and she said, we're going to revisit this. We're going to come back to this, and we're going to have to talk about it again. Another thing was that as we began to learn the language better, become more familiar with the language, we discovered that there are 7 tenses or 7 genders in the language itself. And we had done it all in one gender, in the male point of view. And so we had to go back and re-edit. And so we went back and did all the proper nouns again and redid them in the way we actually heard them, insofar as we can write them in English. Bear in mind, there are sounds that are made that we can't. We have no way to express them. We'd have to make it up as we went. And then we corrected the genders. It's very important when you're translating to agree in number and gender, and you learn a foreign language and you realize that you're just going to be confused all the time if your sentences are not agreeing. They know exactly where you're from. And speaking Spanish, for example, when I went to Argentina as a missionary, I struggled for a little bit settling in down there in Spanish, because I was in an Italian Cambodian district, and the Spanish was very strange. But still, I didn't have the number and gender figured out. Let's see if I can give you an example. He went to the store and they bought boats, little plastic boats, which she floated on the water after his birthday. If you don't agree in number and gender, that's the kind of misunderstanding you can have in translation. And that's kind of what we had going on. There were some squirrely bits that we had to fix. So translation is a tough thing to do.
So just a brief overview of the Nemenhah record. It covers what time to about what time, the record that you translated. Give people that are watching this first time, they've never heard of the Nemenhah record. What period of time does it cover? And for those that are familiar with the Book of Mormon, who are the people that we would be familiar with that kind of broke away, and where did they go?
For those who are familiar with the Book of Mormon, if you know, you're talking about the era right at the end of, say, young Alma the Younger. The story of Haga. I can't even say it the way Hagoth, the boat builder, the shipbuilder. That's kind of the origin. He is the origin of the Nemenhah people. He's the first father of the Nemenhah. They broke away. They traveled up northward, established themselves. Now the book then goes pretty much name by name through the family, all the way through to the generation or the chief just before the Nez Perce War. So, just right about 1860. So
Oh, wow. So it goes clear to 18. So about, we're looking 100 years before Christ, approximately, to 1800 AD.
Well, wasn't it more like, I don't know. I've never really looked at the numbers before. Maybe one of the other editors did. Let me look. I think it was like 245 or
Okay.
no, that was the age of Morconaya. No, they took the dates out. So
And
yeah,
what
it's
I've noticed is there
a
are
couple of
some,
generations before
yeah.
Christ, and then all the way up to the mid to late 1800s.
And what I found is there are two books that have, and maybe there's more and I've missed it, but you have and I'm going to butcher the names. You have obviously Shemuel or Samuel the Lamanite.
Simuet.
And you have him and his story in there. And so we understand now his origin. And we also have the visitation of Christ to those people. But then you have another group of people that's the people of Corianton, who was the son of Alma. Him and Isabel, they also establish a people. Do I understand that right?
Yeah, they did. They jetted out of the land southward and they came north. They were not very well handled or very well treated. And so they just said, like with a great number of people left the South. They could see what was happening, what was about to happen, and they just left. But he went a little bit sooner, and they were taken in by people that were already here, and they made him their ruler. So
Okay.
a lot of the tribes that ended up being out on the plains, the northern woodland tribes, northeast woodland tribes, they took them in. So their territory was more from Hudson's Bay down into the Great Lakes region, and that's where they were. But they were related. The descendants, the other descendants of Hagohl went up the Colorado River and settled up in those mountains. And they conjoined and became one people. And then they broke apart and they conjoined again. History is.
So you kind of you got the Corianton people that are around the Great Lakes area, and then you got the people of Hagoth, and they're more in like the Four Corners, would you say, that we know today, into Utah?
Yeah, they started out there at what we would call Four Corners. That's where their first settlements were.
Where's Four Corners?
Right there where you got Colorado, what is it, New Mexico, Arizona.
Utah.
Kind of a corner, right? Four Corners. Yeah, I forget, not everybody's from the West, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Florida.
Yeah.
So, and then you also get in the record of, I just call him Og because I don't know how to say his name. So you're going to have to tell me. O-U-G.
Oh, it's Ogo.
Ogo?
Ogowa.
Ogoa.
Og.
So
the Book of Og.
I just call him Og. I call him the OG.
Oh no.
And so you also get in that a visitation of Christ as well. So you get two different people, two different visitations of Christ. Now, the other thing that I wanted to just talk to you about, because I feel like I've read the record twice all the way through, and I'm going through it again a third time, because it's one thing if it was just like, oh, this is just like the Book of Mormon 2.0, teaches us the exact same things as the Book of Mormon. But I feel like there are some things that it teaches that answer some questions that people have today. Some of the questions that I know are going on around where I live are women and their role in the priesthood. I know there's questions about homosexuality and how to treat those that are participating in that in their community. Well, they had the same thing happen, and they tell the story of how they did that. Polygamy. And does God have one wife, or does he have more than one wife? Well, that answered my question. This record answered my question in here. And I'm not going to tell you what the answer is. You're going to have to go read it for yourself. I don't want to spoil the book for you. But those are just three. I know, Trevor, you've also spent a ton of time reading the book. Am I missing some others there?
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I think you hit it.
The law of consecration, that's a huge
Law of
one.
consecration, living as actual Zion. It hammers that beautifully.
Yeah, they
Yeah. And then,
built their whole culture. They got to start completely over. It's kind of an analog to what the LDS pioneers wanted to do, I guess, when they came out into the borders of the Lamanites and then further into the Spanish territories of Utah. But they didn't do a very good job. They had a lot of European baggage, whereas Hagotl and his people, they had to be incredibly more tolerant and more inclusive because they were a mixed bag of people. They weren't just one people. There were Lamanites, there were Nephites, there were all kinds of ites. They had to come to a point where they decided to call themselves Nemenha because there were too many different peoples. And I think that made it more less challenging to work out this thing that we, in America anyway, call Zion. Of course, around the world, Zion means something entirely differently than what the Mormons think of it today. But they built their culture, their tradition, their rule of law, their governance. Everything was built around 4 covenants that were made in the temple. And those 4 covenants are actually expressed in that diagram that I just showed you called the medicine wheel. And so they built the covenants of the temple into their society. It was much easier, I think, for them to not make the common mistakes that cultures and societies do.
I know what the 4 covenants are, but can you tell us what the 4 covenants are and give us just a brief explanation of each one of those covenants that they would make?
Well, we spend about half